Hello, Stephen. And Eric is here. Oh, looks like we got two cats today. I don't know if both of them will show up on camera, but they're both all of a sudden very interested in being right in my face right now. I don't like you walking on that stuff, though. Okay, go. He's not coming. I have, lots of stuff to knock over on this dresser that's next to me. I don't want him walking on it. Okay, I don't think he's coming. Anyway, so we just got a nice Bill Nye style lesson. Oh, my voice. This is gonna be fun. Okay. Yeah, so Dana just learned the basics of sympathy from Quoth and his friends. And here's the cat. Just like clockwork. He had no interest in me until just now. It's always when I'm trying to do stuff. Alright. I'm going to try to get through this the best I can because for some reason my voice is very gone. So, Chapter 19. Gentlemen and Thieves. It was late when Denna and I left the Aeolian, and the streets were empty. In the distance I heard fiddle music and the hollow clopping of a horse's hooves on cobblestones. "So what rock have you been hiding under?" she asked. "The usual rock," I said. Then a thought occurred to me. "Did you come looking for me at the university? At the big square building that smells like coal smoke?" Denna shook her head. "I wouldn't begin to know where to find you there. It's like a maze. If I can't catch you playing at anchors, I know I'm out of luck." She looked at me curiously. "Why?" "Someone showed up asking for me," I said with a dismissive gesture. "She said I'd sold her a charm. I thought it might be you." "I did come looking for you a while back," she said, "but I never mentioned your abundant charm." The conversation lulled and silence swelled between us. I couldn't help but think of her walking arm in arm with Ambrose. I didn't want to know any more about it. But at the same time, it was the only thing in my head. "I came to visit you at the Grey Man," I said, just to fill the air between us, "but you'd already gone." She nodded. "Kellen and I had a bit of a falling out." "Nothing too bad, I hope." I gestured to her throat. "I notice you still have the necklace." Denna touched the teardrop emerald absent-mindedly. "No. Nothing terrible. You can say this for Kellen. He's a traditionalist. When he gives a gift, he sticks to it. He said the color flattered me, and I should keep the earrings, too." She sighed. "I'd feel better if he hadn't been so gracious. Still, they're nice to have. A safety net of sorts. They'll make my life easier if I don't hear from my patron soon." "You're still hoping to hear from him?" I asked. "After what happened in Trayvon? After he's been out of contact for more than a month with no word at all?" Denna shrugged. "That's just his way. I told you, he's a secretive sort. It's not odd for him to be gone for long stretches of time." "I have a friend who is trying to find me a patron," I said. "I could have him look for you too." She looked up at me, her eyes unreadable. "It's sweet that you think I deserve better, but I really don't. I have a good voice, but that's it. Who would hire a half-trained musician without even an instrument to her name?" "Anyone with ears to hear you," I said. "Anyone with eyes to see." Denna looked down, her hair falling around her face like a curtain. "You're sweet," she said quietly, making an odd fidgeting gesture with her hands. "What ended up souring things with Kellen?" I asked, steering the conversation somewhere safer. "I spent too much time entertaining gentlemen callers," she said dryly. "You should have explained to him that I'm nothing remotely resembling a gentleman," I said. That might have eased his mind. But I knew I couldn't have been the problem. I'd only managed to visit once. Had it been Ambrose that had come calling? I could picture him in the lavish sitting room all too easily, that damn hat of his hanging casually off the corner of a chair as he drank chocolate and told jokes. Denna's mouth quirked. "It was mostly Joffrey he objected to," she said. "Apparently I was supposed to sit quiet and alone in my little box until he came to call on me." "How is Joffrey?" I asked, to be polite. "Has he managed to get a second thought into his head yet?" I expected to get a laugh, but Denna merely sighed. "He has, but none of them are particularly good thoughts." She shook her head. "He came to Immer to make a name for himself with his poetry, but lost his shirt gambling." "I've heard that story before," I said. "Happens all the time over at the university." "That was just the beginning," she said. "He figured he could win his money back, of course. First came the pawn shop. Then he borrowed money and lost that too. She made a conciliatory gesture. Though in all fairness, he didn't gamble that away. Some bitch rooked him. Caught him with the weeping widow of all things. I looked at her, puzzled. The what? Denna looked at me sideways, then shrugged. It's a simple rook, she said. A young woman stands outside a pawn shop, all flustered and teary. Then when some rich gent walks by, she explains how she came to the city to sell her wedding ring. She needs money for taxes, or to repay a moneylender. She waved her hands impatiently. The details don't matter. What matters is, when she got to town, she asked someone else to pawn the ring for her, because she doesn't know a thing about bargaining, of course. Denna stopped walking in front of a pawn-shop window, her face a mask of distress. I thought I could trust him, she said, but he just pawned it and ran off with the money. There's the ring, right there. She pointed dramatically at the shop's window. But, Denna continued, holding up a finger, luckily he sold the ring for a fraction of what it's worth. It's a family heirloom worth 40 talents, but the pawnshop is selling it for 4. Denna stepped close and laid her hand on my chest, looking up at me with wide, imploring eyes. If you bought the ring, we could sell it for at least 20. I'd give you your 4 talents back right away. She stepped back and shrugged. That sort of thing. I frowned. How is that a rook? I'll catch on as soon as we go to the assessor. Denna rolled her eyes. That's not how it works. We agree to meet tomorrow at noon, but by the time I get there, you've already bought the ring yourself and run off with it. I suddenly understood. And you split the money with the owner of the pawn shop? She patted my shoulder. I knew you'd catch on sooner or later. It seemed fairly watertight, except for one thing. Seems you'd need a special combination of trustworthy yet crooked pawnshop as a partner. True, she admitted. They're usually marked, though. Denna pointed to the top of the nearby pawnshop's door frame. There were a series of marks that could easily be mistaken for random scratches in the paint. Ah, I hesitated for half a moment before adding, in Tarbean, markings like that meant this was a safe place to fence. I groped for an appropriate euphemism. Questionably acquired goods. If Denna was startled by my confession, she gave no sign of it. She merely shook her head and pointed more closely to the markings, moving her fingers as she went. This says, reliable owner, open to simple rooks, even split. She glanced around at the rest of the doorframe and the shop's sign. Nothing about fencing goods from Uncle. I never knew how to read them, I admitted. I glanced sideways at her, careful to keep any judgment out of my tone. And you know how this sort of thing works because... I read it in a book, she said sarcastically. How do you think I know about it? She continued walking down the street. I joined her. I don't usually play it as a widow, Denna said, almost as an afterthought. I'm too young for that. For me, it's my mother's ring, or grandmother's. She shrugged. You change it to whatever feels right at the time. What if the gent is honest? I asked. What if he shows up at noon willing to help? It doesn't happen often. She, with a wry twist... Okay, I think there's a word missing. She said, with a wry twist to her mouth. Only once for me. Caught me completely by surprise. Now I set things up in advance with the owner just in case. I'm happy to rook some greedy bastard who tries to take advantage of a young girl, but I'm not about to take money off someone who's trying to help. Her expression went hard. Unlike the bitch who got hold of Joffrey. Showed up at noon, did he? Of course he did, she said. Just gave her the money. No need to pay me back, miss. You go save the family farm. Denna ran her hands through her hair, looking up at the sky. A farm? That doesn't even make any sense. Why would a farmer's wife have a diamond necklace? She glanced over at me. Why are the sweet ones such idiots with women? He's noble, I said. Can't he just write home? He's never been on good terms with his family, she said. Less so now. His last letter didn't have any money, just the news that his mother was sick. Something in her voice caught my ear. How sick? I asked. Sick. Denna didn't look up. Very sick. And of course he's already sold his horse and can't afford passage on a ship. She sighed again. It's like watching one of those awful tell-in dramas unfold. The path ill-chosen, or something of the sort. Yes, Stephen, there was a word missing in that sentence. Which is, I think, the first time I've noticed something like that. If that's the case, all he has to do is stumble into a church at the end of the 4th act, I said. He'll pray, learn his lesson, and live the rest of his days a clean and virtuous boy. It would be different if he came to me for advice. She made a frustrated gesture. But no, he stops by afterward to tell me what he's done. The guild moneylender cut off his credit, so what does he do? My stomach twisted. He goes to a gaolet, I said. And he was happy when he told me. Denna looked at me, her expression despairing. Like he'd finally figured a way out of this mess. She shivered. Let's go in here. She pointed to a small garden. There's more wind tonight than I thought. I set down my loot case and shrugged out of my cloak. Here, I'm fine. Denna looked like she was going to object for a moment, then drew it around herself. And you say you're not a gentleman, she chided. I'm not, I said. I just know it will smell better after you've worn it. Ah, she said wisely. And then you will sell it to a perfumery and make your fortune. That's been my plan all along, I admitted. A cunning and elaborate scheme. I'm more thief than a gentleman, you see. We sat down on a bench out of the wind. I think you've lost a buckle, she said. I looked down at my loot case. The narrow end was gaping open, and the iron buckle was nowhere to be seen. I sighed and absent-mindedly reached for one of the inner pockets of my cloak. Denna made a tiny noise. Nothing loud, just a startled, indrawn breath as she looked suddenly up at me, her eyes wide and dark in the moonlight. I pulled my hand back as if burned by a fire, stammering an apology. Denna began to laugh quietly. Well, that's embarrassing, she said softly to herself. I'm sorry, I said quickly. I wasn't thinking. I've got some wire in there that I can use to hold this closed for now. Oh, she said. Of course. Her hands moved inside the cloak for a moment, then she held out a piece of wire. I'm sorry, I said again. I was just startled, she said. I didn't think you were the sort to grab hold of a lady without some warning first. I looked down at the loot, embarrassed, and made my hands busy, running the wire through a hole the buckle had left, and twisting it tightly shut. It's a lovely loot, Dennis said after a long, quiet moment. But that case is an absolute shambles. I tapped myself out buying the loot itself, I said, then looked up as if suddenly struck with an idea. I know. I'll ask Joffrey to give me the name of his galet. Then I can afford 2 cases. She swatted at me playfully, and I moved to sit next to her on the bench. Things were quiet for a moment. Then Denna looked down at her hands and repeated a fidgeting gesture she'd made several times during our talk. Only now did I realize what she was doing. Your ring, I asked. What happened to it? Denna gave me an odd look. You've had a ring for as long as I've known you, I explained. Silver with a pale blue stone. Her forehead furrowed. I know what it looked like. How did you? You wear it all the time, I said, trying to sound casual, as if I didn't know every detail of her. As if I didn't know her habit of twirling it on her finger while she was anxious or lost in thought. What happened to it? Denna looked down at her hands. A young gentleman has it, she said. Ah, I said. Then, because I couldn't help myself, I added, Who? I doubt you. She paused, then looked up at me. Actually, you might know him. He goes to the university, too. Ambrose Jackus. My stomach was suddenly filled with acid and ice. Denna looked away. He has a rough charm about him, she explained. More rough than charm, really, but... She trailed off into a shrug. I see, I said. Then, it must be fairly serious. Denna gave me a quizzical look, then realization spread onto her face, and she burst out laughing. She shook her head, waving her hands in violent negation. Oh, no! God, no! Nothing like that. He came calling a few times. We went to a play. He invited me out for dancing. He's remarkably light on his feet. She drew a deep breath and let it out in a sigh. The first night he was very genteel, witty even. The second night, slightly less so. Her eyes narrowed. On the third night he got pushy. Things went sour after that. I had to leave my rooms at the Boar's Head because he kept showing up with trinkets and poems. A feeling of vast relief flooded me. For the first time in days I felt like I was able to take a full lungful of air. I felt a smile threatening to burst out onto my face, and I fought it down, fearing it would be so wide I'd look like an absolute madman. Then it gave me a wry look. You'd be amazed at how similar arrogance and confidence look at first glance. And he was generous and rich, which is a nice combination. She held up her naked hand. The fitting was loose on my ring, and he said he'd have it repaired. I take it he wasn't nearly so generous after things went sour. Her red mouth made another wry smile. Not nearly. I might be able to do something, I said, if the ring's important to you. It was important, Dennis said, giving me a frank look. But what would you do exactly? Remind him, one gentleman to another, that he should treat women with dignity and respect? She rolled her eyes. Good luck. I simply gave her my most charming smile. I'd already told her the truth of things. I was no gentleman. I was a thief. She likes the bad guys. The word was, I believe, said, or replied, or something to that effect. I don't know. It just said, she, with, so there was a verb missing after the sentence. After the line of dialogue or whatever. Yeah, it appears she likes the bad boys a little bit. I can see that. What are you messing with over there? Stop it. No. Okay. You gonna come on my lap? Chapter 20. The Fickle Wind. The next evening found me at the Golden Pony, arguably the finest inn on the university side of the river. It boasted elaborate kitchens, a fine stable, and a skilled, obsequious staff. It was the sort of upscale establishment only the wealthiest students could afford. I wasn't inside, of course. I was crouched in the deep shadows of the roof, trying not to dwell on the fact that what I was planning went well beyond the bounds of conduct unbecoming. If I was caught breaking into Ambrose's rooms, I would undoubtedly be expelled. It was a clear autumn night with a strong wind, a mixed blessing. The sound of rustling leaves would cover any small noises I might make, but I worried the flapping edges of my cloak might draw attention. Our plan was a simple one. I had slipped a sealed note under Ambrose's door. It was an unsigned, flirtatious request for a meeting in Imra. Will had written it, as Sim and I judged he had the most feminine handwriting. It was a goose chase, but I guessed Ambrose would take the bait. I would have preferred to have someone distract him personally, but the fewer people involved, the better. I could have asked Denna to help, but I wanted it to be a surprise when I returned her ring. Even though you'd already told her you were going to give it back to her? Okay. Will and Sim were my lookouts. Will in the common room, Sim in the alley by the back door. It was their job to let me know when Ambrose left the building. More importantly, they would alert me if he came back before I'd finished searching his rooms. I felt a sharp tug in my right-hand pocket as the oak twig gave 2 distinct twitches. After a moment, the signal was repeated. Willem was letting me know Ambrose had left the inn. In my left pocket was a piece of birch. Simon held a similar one where he stood, watch over the inn's back door. It was a simple, effective signaling system, if you knew enough sympathy to make it work. I did question the book. That makes sense, though, right? What I said? I crawled down the slope of the roof, moving carefully over the heavy clay tiles. I knew from my younger days in Tarbian that they tended to crack and slide and could make you lose your footing. I made it to the lip of the roof, 15 feet off the ground. Hardly a dizzying height, but more than enough to break a leg or a neck. A narrow piece of roof ran beneath the long row of second-story windows. There were 10 in all, and the middle 4 belonged to Ambrose. I flexed my fingers a couple times to loosen them, then began to edge along the narrow strip of roof. The secret is to concentrate on what you're doing. Don't look at the ground, don't look over your shoulder, ignore the world and trust it to return the favor. This was the real reason I was wearing my cloak. If I was spotted, I would be nothing more than a dark shape in the night, impossible to identify, hopefully. The first window was dark, and the second had its curtains drawn. But the third was dimly lit. I hesitated. If you're fair-skinned like me, you never want to peer into a window at night. Your face will stand out against the dark like the full moon. Rather than risk peering in, I dug around in the pockets of my cloak until I found a piece of scrap tin from the fishery that I'd buffed into a makeshift mirror. Then I carefully used it to peer around the corner and through the window. Inside, there were a few dim lamps and a canopy bed as big as my entire room back in Anchor's. The bed was occupied. Actively occupied. What's more, there seemed to be more naked limbs than 2 people could account for. Unfortunately, my piece of tin was small and I couldn't view the scene in its full complexity, otherwise I might have learned some very interesting things. I briefly considered going back and coming at Ambrose's rooms from the other side, but the wind gusted suddenly, sending leaves skipping across the cobblestones and trying to claw me away from my narrow footing. Heart pounding, I decided to risk passing this window. I guessed the people inside had better things to do than stargazing. I pulled the hood of my cloak down and held the edges in my teeth, covering my face while leaving my hands free. Thus blinded, I inched my way past the window, listening intently for any signs I'd been spotted. There were a few surprised noises, but they didn't seem to have anything to do with me. Kinky. The first of Ambrose's windows was elaborate stained glass, pretty but not designed to open. The next was perfect, a wide double window. I pulled a thin piece of copper wire from one of the pockets of my cloak and used it to trip the simple latch holding it closed. When the window wouldn't open, I realized that Ambrose had added a drop bar as well. That took several long minutes of tricky work, one-handed in the near-total dark. Thankfully, the wind had died down, at least for the moment. Then, once I'd worked my way past the drop bar, the window still wouldn't budge. I began to curse Ambrose's paranoia as I searched for the third lock. I mean, it's justified paranoia, I guess. As I searched for the third lock, hunting for nearly 10 minutes before I realized the window was simply stuck shut. I tugged on it a couple times, which isn't as easy as it sounds. They don't put handles on the outside, you realize. Eventually, I got overenthusiastic and pulled too hard. The window sprang open and my weight shifted backward. I leaned off the edge of the roof, fighting every reflex that urged me to move my foot back and regain my balance, knowing there was nothing but 15 feet of empty air behind me. Do you know the feeling when you tip your chair too far and begin to fall backward? The sensation was something like that, mixed with self-recrimination and the fear of death. I flailed my arms, knowing it wouldn't help, my mind gone suddenly blank with panic. The wind saved me. It gusted as I teetered on the edge of the roof, giving me just enough of a push that I could regain my balance. One of my flailing arms caught the now open window, and I scrambled desperately inside, not caring how much noise I made. Once through the window, I crouched on the floor, breathing hard. My heart was just beginning to slow when the wind caught the window and slammed it closed above my head, startling me all over again. It's not paranoia if everyone really is out to get you. Exactly. I brought out my sympathy lamp, thumbed the switch to a dim setting, and swept the narrow arc of light around the room. Kilvin had been right to call it a thief's lamp. It was perfect for this sort of skulking about. It was miles to Imra and back, and I trusted Ambrose's curiosity would keep him waiting for his secret admirer for at least half an hour. Normally looking for something as small as a ring would be a full day's job, but I guessed Ambrose wouldn't even think of hiding it. In his mind, it was something he'd stolen. He would consider it either a trinket or a trophy. Oh, sorry, it wasn't something he'd stolen. I set about methodically searching Ambrose's rooms. The ring wasn't on his chest of drawers or the bedside table. It wasn't in any of his desk drawers or on his jewelry tray in his dressing room. He didn't even have a locked jewelry box, mind you, just a tray with all manner of pins, rings, and chains scattered carelessly across it. I left everything where it was, which isn't to say I didn't think about robbing the bastard blind. Just a few pieces of his jewelry could pay my tuition for a year. But it went against my plan. Get in, find the ring, and get out. So long as I left no evidence of my visit, I guessed Ambrose would simply assume he'd lost the ring if he noticed it was gone at all. It was the perfect sort of crime. No suspicion, no pursuit, no consequences. Besides, it's notoriously difficult to fence jewelry in a town as small as Imra. It would be far too easy for someone to trace it back to me. That said, I've never claimed to be a priest, and there were plenty of opportunities for mischief in Ambrose's rooms. So I indulged myself. While checking Ambrose's pockets, I weakened a few seams so there was a fair chance of him splitting his pants up the back the next time he sat down or mounted his horse. I loosened the handle on his chimney's flue so it would eventually fall off, and his room would fill with smoke while he scrambled to reattach it. I was trying to think of something to do to his damned, irritating plumed hat he really hates that hat, when the oak twig in my pocket twitched violently, making me jump. Then it twitched again and broke sharply in half. I cursed bitterly under my breath. Ambrose couldn't have been gone more than 20 minutes. What had brought him back so soon? I clicked off my sympathy lamp and stuffed it into my cloak. Then I scurried into the next room to make my escape through the window. It was irritating to go through all the trouble of getting in just to leave again, but as long as Ambrose didn't know anyone had broken into his rooms, I could simply come back another night. But the window didn't open. I pushed harder, wondering if it had jammed itself shut when the wind had slammed it. Then I glimpsed a thin strip of brass running along the inside of the windowsill. I couldn't read the sigildry in the dim light, but I know wards when I see them. That explained why Ambrose was back so soon. He knew someone had broken in. What's more, the best sort of wards wouldn't just warn of an intruder. They could hold a door or window shut to seal a thief in. I bolted for the door, hands scrabbling in the pockets of my cloak, looking for something long and slender I could use to foul the lock. Not finding anything suitable, I snatched a pen from his writing desk, jammed it into the keyhole, then jerked it hard sideways, breaking the metal head off inside the lock. A moment later I heard a grating metallic noise as Ambrose attempted to unlock the door from his side, fumbling and cursing when he couldn't get his key to fit. By that point I was already back at the window, shining my lamp back and forth along the strip of brass and murmuring runes under my breath. It was simple enough. I could render it useless by scratching out a handful of connecting runes, then open the window and escape. I hurried back to the sitting room and snatched the letter opener off his desk, knocking over the capped inkwell in my hurry. I was just about to begin eliding runes when I realized how stupid that would be. Any petty thief could break into Ambrose's rooms, but the number of people who knew enough sigildry to foul a ward was much lower. I might as well sign my name on his window frame. I took a moment to collect my thoughts, then returned the letter opener to the desk and replaced the inkwell. I returned and examined the long brass strip more closely. Breaking something is simple. Understanding it is harder. I took a moment to collect my thoughts, then returned the letter opener... Oh, sorry, I read that already. This is doubly true when you are confined with the sounds of muttered cursing from behind a door, accompanied by the clack and rattle of someone trying to unjam a lock. Then the hallway went quiet, which was even more unnerving. I finally managed to puzzle out the sequence of wards as I heard several sets of footsteps in the hall. I broke my mind into 3 pieces and focused my LR as I pushed against the window. My hands and feet grew cold as I pulled heat from my body to counteract the ward, trying not to panic as I heard a loud thump as something heavy struck the door. The window swung open, and I scrambled backward over the sash and onto the roof as something struck the door again, and I heard the sharp crack of splintering wood. I still could have made it away safely, but when I set my right foot down on the roof, I felt a clay tile crack under my weight. As my foot slid, I grabbed the windowsill with both hands to steady myself. Then the wind gusted, catching the open window and flinging it toward my head. I brought up my arm to protect my face, and it struck my elbow instead, smashing one of the small panes of glass. The impact pushed me sideways onto my right foot, which slid the rest of the way out from underneath me. Then, since all my other options seemed to be exhausted, I decided it would be best if I fell off the roof. Acting on pure instinct, my hands scrabbled madly. I dislodged a few more clay tiles, then caught hold of the lip of the roof. My grip wasn't good, but it slowed and spun me so that I didn't land on my head or my back. I instead landed face down, like a cat. Except a cat's legs are all the same length. I landed on my hands and knees. My hands merely stung, but my knees, striking the cobblestones, hurt as badly as anything I'd ever felt in my entire young life. The pain was blinding, and I heard myself yelp like a dog that's been kicked. A second later, a hail of heavy red roofing tiles fell around me. Most shattered on the cobblestones, but one clipped the back of my head, while another caught me square on the elbow, making my entire forearm go numb. I didn't spare it a moment's thought. A broken arm would heal, but the expulsion from the university would last a lifetime. I pulled my hood up and forced myself to my feet. Using one hand to make sure the hood of my cloak stayed in place, I staggered a few steps until I was under the eaves of the Golden Pony, out of sight of the upstairs window. Then I was running. Second. That went well. Eventually I made my careful, limping way onto the rooftops and let myself into my room by the window. It was slow going, but I had little choice. I couldn't walk past everyone in the tap room, disheveled, limping, and generally looking as if I had just fallen off a roof. Once I caught my breath and spent some time abusing myself for several types of blinding idiocy, I took stock of my wounds. The good news was that I hadn't broken either of my legs, but I had splendid bruises blooming just below each knee. The tile that had grazed my head had left a lump, but hadn't cut me, and while my elbow throbbed with a dull ache, my hand was no longer numb. There was a knock at the door. I froze for a moment, then drew the birch twig from my pocket, muttering a quick binding, and jerked it back and forth. Excuse me. I heard a startled noise from out in the hall, followed by Willem's low laugh. "That's not funny," I heard Sim say. "Let us in." I let them in. Simmons sat on the edge of the bed, and Willem took the chair by the desk. I closed the door and sat on the other half of the bed. Even with all of us seated, the tiny room was crowded. We eyed each other soberly for a moment. Then Simmons spoke up. "Apparently Ambrose startled a thief in his rooms tonight. Fellow jumped out a window rather than got caught." I gave a brief, humorless laugh. "Hardly. I was almost out when the window blew shut on me." I gestured awkwardly. "Knocked me off the roof." Willem let out a relieved sigh. "I thought I botched the binding." I shook my head. "I had plenty of warning. I just wasn't as careful as I should have been." "Why was he back so early?" Simon asked, looking at Willem. "Did you hear anything when he came in?" "It probably occurred to him that my handwriting is not especially feminine," Willem said. "All right, you need to stop this." No. Oops, sorry. Now I'm lost. Okay. "He had wards on his windows," I said. "Probably linked to a ring or something he carries with him. They must have tipped him off as soon as I opened the window." "Did you get it?" Willem asked. I shook my head. Simon craned his neck to get a better look at my arm. "Are you okay?" I followed his eyes, but didn't see anything. Then I tugged at my shirt and noticed that it was stuck to the back of my arm. With all my other pains, I hadn't noticed it. Moving gingerly, I pulled my shirt up over my head. The elbow of the shirt was torn and speckled with blood. I cursed bitterly. I only owned 4 shirts, and now this one was ruined. I tried to get a look at my injury, and quickly realized that you couldn't get a look at the back of your own elbow, no matter how much you wanted to. Eventually, I held it up for Simmons' inspection. "It's not much," he said, holding his fingers a little more than 2 inches apart. There's only one cut, and it's hardly bleeding. The rest of it's just scraped up. It looks like you scuffed it hard against something. Clay tile from the roof fell on me, I said. Lucky, Willem grunted. Who else could fall off a roof and end up with nothing more than a few scrapes? I've got bruises on my knees the size of apples, I said. I'll be lucky if I can walk tomorrow. But deep down I knew he was right. The clay tile that had landed on my elbow could have easily broken my arm. The broken edges of the clay tiles were sometimes sharp as knives, so if it had hit me differently, it could have cut me down to the bone. I hate clay roofing tiles. Well, it could have been worse, Simmons said briskly as he came to his feet. Let's go to the Medica and get you patched up. Crem, no, Willem said. He can't go to the Medica. They will be asking to see if anyone is hurt. Simmons sat down again. Of course, he said, sounding vaguely disgusted with himself. I knew that. He looked me over. At least you're not hurt anywhere that people can see. I looked at Willem. You have a problem with blood, don't you? His expression grew slightly offended. I wouldn't say. His eyes darted to my elbow and his face grew a little pale despite his dark sealedish complexion. His mouth made a thin line. Yes. Fair enough. I started to cut my ruined shirt into strips of cloth. Congratulations, Sim. You've been promoted to field medic. I opened a drawer and brought out a hook needle and gut, iodine, and a small pot of goose grease. Sim looked at the needle, then back at me, eyes wide. I gave him my best smile. Easy. I'll talk you through it. I sat on the floor with my arm over my head while Simon washed, stitched, and bandaged my elbow. He surprised me by being nowhere near as squeamish as I'd expected. His hands were more careful and confident than those of many students in the Medica who did this sort of thing all the time. So the three of us were here playing breath all night? Will asked, pointedly avoiding looking in my direction. Oh, that's the cover story. Okay. Sounds good, Sim said. Can we say I won? No, I said. People must have seen Will at the pony. Lie and they'll catch me for sure. Oh, Sim said. What do we say then? The truth. I pointed at Will. You were at the pony during the excitement, then came here to tell me about it. I nodded to the small table where a mass of gears, springs, and screws were spread in disarray. I showed you the harmony clock I found, and you both gave me advice on how to fix it. Sim seemed disappointed. Not very exciting. Simple lies are best, I said, getting to my feet. Thanks again, both of you. This could have gone terribly wrong without the two of you looking out for me. Simon got to his feet and opened the door. Will stood as well, but didn't turn to leave. I heard a strange rumor the other night, he said. Anything interesting? I asked. He nodded. Very. I remember hearing that you were done antagonizing a certain powerful member of the nobility. I was surprised that you had finally decided to let sleeping dogs lie. Come on, Will, Simon said. Ambrose isn't sleeping. He's a dog with the froth that deserves to be put down. He more resembles an angry bear, Willem said. One you seem determined to prod with a burning stick. How can you say that? Sim said hotly. In 2 years as a scrib, has he ever called you anything other than a filthy shim? And what about that time he almost blinded me by mixing my salts? Quoth will be working the plumb bob out of his system for... Will held up his hand and nodded to acknowledge Simon's point. I know this to be true, which is why I let myself be drawn into such foolishness. I merely wished to make a point. He looked at me. You realize you have gone well over the hill concerning this Denna girl, don't you? And that's the end of that chapter. Okay. Chapter 21. Piecework. The pain in my knees kept me from any sort of decent sleep that night. So when the sky outside my window started to show the first pale light of coming dawn, I gave up, got dressed, and made my slow, painful way to the outskirts of town, looking for willow bark to chew. Along the way I discovered several new, exciting bruises I hadn't been aware of the night before. The walk was pure agony, but I was glad I was making it in the early morning dark, when the streets were empty. There was bound to be a lot of talk about last night's excitement at the Golden Pony. If anyone saw me limping, it would be too easy for them to jump to the right conclusions. Luckily, the trip loosened the stiffness in my legs, and the willow bark took the edge off the pain. By the time the sun was fully up, I felt well enough to appear in public. So I headed to the fishery, hoping to get in a few hours of piecework before adept sympathy. I needed to start earning money for next term's tuition, and Devi's loan, not to mention bandages and a new shirt. Jackson wasn't in the stocks when I arrived, but I recognized the student there. We had entered the university at the same time and bunked close to each other for a little while in the mews. I liked him. He wasn't one of the nobility who drifted blithely through school, carried by his family's name and money. His parents were wool merchants, and he worked to pay his tuition. "Basil," I said, "I thought you made a leer last term. What are you doing in the stocks?" He flushed a little, looking embarrassed. Kilvin caught me adding water to acid. I shook my head, giving a stern scowl. "This is contrary to proper procedure, Elir Basil," I said, dropping my voice an octave. "An artificer must move with perfect care in all things." Basil grinned. "You've got his accent." He opened the ledger book. "What can I get you?" "I'm not feeling up for anything more complicated than piecework right now," I said. "How about—" "Hold on," Basil interrupted, frowning down at the ledger book. "What?" He spun the ledger around to face me and pointed. "There's a note next to your name." I looked. Penciled in Kilvin's strangely childlike scrawl was, "No materials or tools to Relar Kvoth. Send him to me. Kilvin." Basil gave me a sympathetic look. "It's acid to water," he joked gently. "Did you forget to?" "I wish I had," I said. "Then I'd know what was going on." Basil looked around nervously, then leaned forward and spoke in a low voice. "Listen, I saw that girl again." I blinked at him stupidly. "What?" "The girl that came in here looking for you," he prompted. "The young one that was looking for the red-headed wizard who sold her a charm." I closed my eyes and rubbed at my face. "She came back? This is the last thing I need right now." Basil shook his head. "She didn't come in," he said. "At least not that I know of. But I've seen her a couple times outside. She hangs around the courtyard." He jerked his head toward the southern exit of the fishery. "Did you tell anyone?" I asked. Basil looked profoundly offended. "I wouldn't do that to you," he said. "But she might have talked to someone else. You should really get rid of her. Kilvin will spit nails if he thinks you've been selling charms." "I haven't been," I said. "I've got no idea who she is. What does she look like?" "Young," Basil said with a shrug. "Not sealdish. I think she had light hair. She wears a blue cloak with the hood up. I tried to walk over and talk to her, but she just ran away." I rubbed my forehead. "Wonderful." Basil shrugged sympathetically. "Just thought I'd warn you. If she actually comes in here and asks for you, I'll have to tell Kilvin." He grimaced apologetically. "I'm sorry, but I'm in enough trouble as it is." "I understand," I said. "Thanks for the warning." No, yeah, Basil is a name. It makes me think of Basil of Baker Street. And basil is a spice. I doubt anyone would have the name pronounced that way, but this book is weird with names and languages and stuff, so you never know. But I'm going to say Basil because I believe that's correct. When I walked into the workshop, I was immediately struck by a strange quality of light in the room. The first thing I did was look up, checking to see if Kilvin had added a new lamp to the array of glass spheres hanging up among the rafters. I hoped the change in light was due to a new lamp. Kilvin's mood was always foul when one of his lamps went unexpectedly dark. Scanning the rafters, I didn't see any dark lamps. It took me a long moment to realize the strange quality of the light was due to actual sunlight slanting in through the low windows on the eastern wall. Normally I didn't come to work until later in the day. The workshop was almost eerily quiet this early in the morning. The huge room seemed hollow and lifeless, with only a handful of students working on projects. That, combined with the odd light and the unexpected summons from Kilvin, made me rather uneasy as I crossed the room heading toward Kilvin's office. Despite the early hour, a small forge in the corner of Kilvin's office was already well stoked. A heat billowed past me as I stood in the open doorway. It felt good after the early winter chill outside. Kilvin stood with his back to me, working the bellows with a relentless rhythm. I knocked loudly on the frame of the door to get his attention. "Master Kilvin?" "I just tried to check some materials out of stocks." "Oh, I thought I saw an end quote." "Master Kilvin? I just tried to check some materials out of stocks. Is anything the matter?" Kilvin glanced over in my direction. "Relar Kvoth, I will be a moment. Come in." I stepped into his office and swung the heavy door closed behind me. If I was in trouble, I'd rather not have anyone listening in. Kilvin continued to work the bellows for a long moment. It was only when he drew out a long tube that I realized it wasn't a forge he was firing, it was a small glasswork. Moving deftly, he drew out a blob of molten glass on the end of his tube, then proceeded to blow an increasingly large bubble of glass. After a minute, the glass lost its orange glow. "Bellows," Kilvin said, without looking at me, putting the tube back into the mouth of the glasswork. I scrambled to obey, working the bellows in a steady rhythm until the glass was glowing orange again. Kilvin motioned me to stop, pulled it out, and puffed at the tube for another long moment. spinning the glass until the bubble was large as a sweet melon. He set it back in the glasswork again, and I pumped the bellows without being asked. By the third time we repeated this, I was wringing with sweat. I wished I hadn't closed Kilvin's door, but I didn't want to leave the bellows for the time it would take for me to open it again. Kilvin didn't seem to notice the heat. The glass bubble grew large as my head, then big as a pumpkin. But the fifth time he drew it from the heat and began to blow, it sagged on the end of the tube, deflating and falling to the floor. "Kist Kraelen, Kote," he swore furiously. He threw down the metal tube where it rang sharply against the stone floor. "Kramet Brivetan Erin." I fought down the sudden urge to laugh. My Siaru wasn't perfect, but I was fairly certain Kilvin had said, "Shit in God's beard." That's fantastic. I love that. The bear-like master stood for a moment, looking down at the ruined glass on the floor. Then he let out a long, irritated breath through his nose, pulled off his goggles, and turned to look at me. "3 sets of synchronized bells, brass," he said without preamble. 1 tap and catch, iron. 4 heat funnels, iron. 6 siphons, tin. 22 panes of twice tough glass and other assorted piecework. It was a list of all the work I had done this term in the fishery. Simple things I could finish and sell back to stocks for a quick profit. Kilvin looked at me with his dark eyes. "Does this work please you, Relarkvoth?" "The projects are easy enough, Master Kilvin," I said. "You are now a Relar," he said, his voice heavy with reproach. "Are you content to coast idly, making toys for the lazy rich?" he asked. "Is that what you desire from your time in the fishery? Easy work?" I could feel the sweat beating up in my hair and running down my back. "I am somewhat leery of venturing off on my own," I said. "You didn't particularly approve of the modifications I made to my hand lamp." "Those are cowards' words," Kilvin said. "Will you never leave the house because you were scolded once?" He looked at me. "I ask you again. Bells, castings, does this work please you, Relarkvoth?" "The thought of paying next term's tuition pleases me, Master Kilvin." Sweat was running down my face. I tried to wipe it away with my sleeve, but my shirt was already soaked through. I glanced at Kilvin's office door. "And the work itself?" Kilvin prompted. There was sweat beading on the dark skin of his forehead, but he didn't seem otherwise bothered by the heat. "Truthfully, Master Kilvin?" I asked, feeling a little lightheaded. He looked a bit offended. "I value truth in all things, Relarkvoth." "The truth is I've made 8 deck lamps this year, Master Kilvin. If I have to make another, I expect I might shit myself from pure boredom." Kilvin huffed something that could have been a laugh, then smiled widely at me. "Good. That is how a Relar should feel." He pointed one thick finger at me. "You are clever, and you have good hands. I expect great things from you, not drudgery. Make something clever, and it will earn you more than a lamp. Certainly more than piecework. Leave that to the Elir." He gestured dismissively at the window that looked out over the workshop. "I'll do my best, Master Kilvin," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and tinny. "Do you mind if I open the door and get some fresh air in here?" Kilvin grunted in agreement, and I took a step toward the door. But my legs felt loose and my head spun. I staggered and almost fell headlong onto the floor, but I managed to catch the edge of the work table and merely went to my knees instead. When my bruised knees hit the stone floor, it was excruciating, but I didn't shout or cry out. In fact, the pain seemed to be coming from a long way off. "Just don't do it in God's beard." I really like that. Shit in God's beard. This man, I mean, he's an amazing writer, and my God, like, the world building in this book and the story and the characters, amazing. But his insults and his curses, that's just amazing. I awoke confused, with a mouth as dry as sawdust. My eyes were gummy and my thoughts so sluggish it took me a long moment to recognize the distinctive antiseptic tang in the air. That, combined with the fact that I was lying naked under a sheet, let me know I was in the Medica. I turned my head and saw short blonde hair and the dark physiker's uniform. I relaxed back onto the pillow. "Hello, Mola," I croaked. She turned and gave me a serious look. "Kvoth," she said formally. "How do you feel?" Still bleary, I had to think about it. "Thick," I said. Then, "thirsty." Mola brought me a glass and helped me drink. It was sweet and gritty. It took me a long moment to finish it, but by the time I was done I felt halfway human again. "What happened?" I asked. "You fainted in the artificery," she said. "Kilvin carried you over here himself. It was rather touching, actually. I had to shoo him away." I felt my entire body flush with shame at the thought of being carried through the streets of the university by the huge master. I must have looked like a rag doll in his arms. I fainted? Kilvin explained you were in a hot room, Mola said, and you'd sweat through your clothes. You were dripping wet. She gestured to where my shirt and pants lay wadded on the table. Heat exhaustion? I said. Mola held up a hand to quiet me. That was my first diagnosis, she said. On further examination, I've decided you're actually suffering from an acute case of jumping out of a window last night. She gave me a pointed look. I suddenly became self-conscious. Not of my near-nakedness, but of the obvious injuries I'd received when I'd fallen off the roof of the Golden Pony. I glanced at the door and was relieved to see it was closed. Mola stood watching me, her expression carefully blank. Has anyone else seen? I asked. Mola shook her head. We've been busy today. I relaxed a bit. That's something, then. Her expression was grim. This morning Arwell gave orders to report any suspicious injuries. It's no secret why. Ambrose himself has offered a sizable reward to whoever helps him catch a thief who broke into his rooms and stole several valuables, including a ring his mother gave him on her deathbed. That bastard! I said hotly. I didn't steal anything. Mola raised an eyebrow. As easy as that? No denial? No anything? I exhaled through my nose, trying to get my temper under control. I'm not going to insult your intelligence. It's pretty obvious I didn't fall down some stairs. I took a deep breath. Look, Mola, if you tell anyone, they'll expel me. I didn't steal anything. I could have, but I didn't. Then why? She hesitated, obviously uncomfortable. What were you doing? I sighed. Would you believe I was doing a favor for a friend? Mola gave me a shrewd look, her green eyes searching mine. Well, you do seem to be in the favor business lately. What? I asked, my thoughts moving too sluggishly to follow what she was saying. The last time you were here, I treated you for burns and smoke inhalation after pulling Fela out of a fire. Oh, I said. That's not really a favor. Anyone would have done that. Mola gave me a searching look. You really believe that, don't you? She shook her head a little, then picked up a hardback and made a few notes on it, no doubt filling out her treatment report. Well, I consider it a favor. Fela and I bunked together back when we were both new here. Despite what you think, it's not something a lot of people would have done. There was a knock and Sim's voice came from the hallway. Can we come in? Without waiting for an answer, he opened the door and led an uncomfortable-looking Willem into the room. We heard... Sim paused and turned to look at Mola. He's going to be okay, right? He'll be fine, Mola said, provided his temperature levels out. She picked up a key gauge and stuck it in my mouth. I know this will be hard for you, but try to keep your mouth shut for a minute. In that case, Simon said with a grin, we heard Kilvin took you somewhere private and showed you something that made you faint like a little sissy girl. I scowled at him, but I kept my mouth shut. Mola turned back to Will and Sim. His legs are going to hurt for a while, but there's no permanent damage. His elbow should be fine too, though the stitching's a mess. What the hell were you guys doing in Ambrose's rooms anyway? Willem simply looked at her, and characteristically dark-eyed and stoic. No such luck with Sim. Kvoth needed to get a ring for his lady love, he chirped cheerfully. Mola turned to look at me, her expression furious. You have a hell of a lot of nerve to lie right to my face, she said, her eyes flat and angry as a cat's. Thank goodness you didn't want to insult my intelligence or anything. I took a deep breath and reached up to take the key gauge out of my mouth. God damn it, Sim, I said crossly. Someday I'm going to teach you to lie. Sim looked back and forth between the two of us, flushed with panic and embarrassment. Kvoth has a thing for a girl over the river, he said defensively. Ambrose took a ring of hers and won't give it back. Mola cut him off with a sharp gesture. Why didn't you just tell me that? She demanded of me, irritated. Everyone knows what Ambrose is like with women. That's why I didn't tell you, I said. It sounded like a very convenient lie. There's also the fact that it is not one whit of your goddamn business. Her expression hardened. You come off pretty high and mighty for... Stop. Just stop, Willem said, startling both of us out of our argument. He turned to Mola. When Kvoth came here unconscious, what did you do first? I checked his pupils for signs of head trauma, Mola said automatically. What the hell does that have to do with anything? Willem gestured in my direction. Look at his eyes now. Mola looked at me. They're dark, she said, sounding surprised. Dark green, like a pine bough. Will continued. Don't argue with him when his eyes go dark like that. No good comes of it. It's like the noise a rattlesnake makes, Sim said. More like hackles on a dog, Willem corrected. It shows when he's ready to bite. All of you can go straight to hell, I said. Or you can give me a mirror so I can see what you're talking about. I don't care which. Will ignored me. Our little Kvoth has a flash-pan temper, but once he's had a minute to cool down, he will realize the truth. Will gave me a pointed look. He's not upset because you didn't trust him, or that you tricked him. or that you tricked Sim. He's upset because you found out what asinine lengths he is willing to go to in order to impress a woman. He looked at me. Is asinine the right word? I took a deep breath and let it out. Pretty much, I admitted. I chose it because it sounded like ass, Will said. I knew you two had to be involved, Mola said with a hint of apology in her voice. Honestly, the three of you are thick as thieves, and I do mean that in all its various clever implications. She walked around the side of the bed and looked critically at my wounded elbow. Which one of you stitched him up? Me, Sim grimaced. I know I made a mess of it. Mess would be generous, Mola said, looking it over critically. It looks like you were trying to stitch your name onto him and kept misspelling it. I think he did quite well, Will said, meeting her eye, considering his lack of training and the fact that he was helping a friend under less than ideal circumstances. Mola flushed. I didn't mean it like that, she said quickly. Working here, it's easy to forget that not everyone... She turned to Sim. I'm sorry. Sim ran his hand through his sandy hair. I suppose you could make it up to me sometime, he said, grinning boyishly. Like maybe tomorrow afternoon, when you let me buy you lunch. He looked at her hopefully. Mola rolled her eyes and sighed, somewhere between amusement and exasperation. Fine. My work here is done, Will said gravely. I'm leaving. I hate this place. Thanks, Will, I said. He gave a perfunctory wave over one shoulder and closed the door behind him. Yeah, assassin has ass in it twice. Mola agreed to leave mention of my suspicious injuries off her report and stuck to her original diagnosis of heat exhaustion. She also cut away Sim's stitches, then re-cleaned, re-sewed, and re-bandaged my arm. Not a pleasant experience, but I knew it would heal more quickly under her experienced care. In closing, she advised me to drink more water, get some sleep, and suggested that in the future I refrain from strenuous physical activity in a hot room the day after falling off a roof. Okay. Chapter 22. Slipping. Up until this point in the term, Elxadal had been teaching us theory and adept sympathy. How much light could be produced from 10 thoms of continuous heat using iron, using basalt, using human flesh. We memorized tables of figures and learned how to calculate escalating squares, angular momentum, and compounded degradations. Simply said, it was mind-numbing. Don't get me wrong, I knew it was essential information. Bindings of the sort we'd shown Denna were simple. But when things grew complicated, a skilled sympathist needed to do some fairly tricky calculations. In terms of energy, there isn't much difference between lighting a candle and melting it into a puddle of tallow. The only difference is one of focus and control. When the candle is sitting in front of you, these things are easy. You simply stare at the wick and stop pouring in heat when you see the first flicker of flame. But if the candle is a quarter mile away or in a different room, focus and control are exponentially more difficult to maintain. Well, luckily, I'm definitely not hot here. It's nice and cool in my room. But my throat is it's trying, but it's very scratchy today. So I do still need water. And there are worse things than melted candles waiting for a careless sympathist. The question Denna had asked in the Aeolian, it's still so hard to say, was all important. Where does the extra energy go? As Will had explained, some went into the air, some went into the linked items, and the rest went into the sympathist's body. The technical term for it was thaumatic overfill. Thalmic overfill. But even Elxadal tended to refer to it as slippage. Every year or so, some careless sympathist with a strong alar channeled enough heat through a bad link to spike his body temperature and drive himself fever mad. Dahl told us of one extreme case where a student managed to cook himself from the inside out. I mentioned the last to Manet the day after Dahl shared the story with our class. I expected him to join me in some healthy scoffing, but it turned out Manet had actually been a student back when it happened. Aeolian. Smelled like pork, Manet said grimly. Jesus Christ. Damnedest thing. Felt bad for him, of course, but you can only feel so much pity for an idiot. A little slippage here and there you hardly notice, but he must have slipped 200,000 thoms inside 2 seconds. Manet shook his head, not looking up from the piece of tin he was engraving. Whole wing of mains reeked. Nobody could use those rooms for a year. I stared at him. Thermal slippage is fairly common, though, Manet continued. Now kinetic slippage. He raised his eyebrows appreciatively. 20 years back, some damn fool Eltha got drunk and tried to lift a manure cart onto the roof of the master's hall on a bet. Tore his own arm off at the shoulder. Manet bent back over his piece of tin, engraving a careful rune. Takes a special kind of stupid to do something like that. The next day I was especially attentive to what Dal had to say. He drilled us mercilessly. Calculations for enthalpy, charts showing distance of decay, equations that describe the entropic curves a skilled sympathist needs to understand on an almost instinctive level. I don't know what splinching is. But Dal was no fool, so before we grew bored and sloppy, he turned it into a competition. He made us draw heat from odd sources, from red-hot irons, from blocks of ice, from our own blood. Lighting candles in distant rooms was the easiest of it. Lighting one of a dozen identical candles was harder. Lighting a candle you'd never actually seen in an unknown location, it was like juggling in the dark. There were contests of precision, contests of finesse, contests of focus and control. After 2 span, I was the highest-ranked student in our class of 23, Relar. Fenton nipped at my heels in second place. As luck would have it, the day after my assault on Ambrose's rooms was the same day we began dueling in adept sympathy. Dueling required all the subtlety and control of our previous competitions, with the added challenge of having another student actively opposing your Relar. So despite my recent trip to the Medica for heat exhaustion, I melted a hole through a block of ice in a distant room. Despite 2 nights of scant sleep, I raised the temperature of a pint of mercury exactly 10 degrees. Despite my throbbing bruises and the stinging itch of my bandaged arm, I tore the King of Spades in half while leaving the other cards in the deck untouched. All of these things I did in less than 2 minutes, despite the fact that Fenton set the whole of his Alar to oppose me. It is not for nothing that they came to call me Quoth the Arcane. My Alar was like a blade of Ramston steel. Oh, right. Okay, I forgot about that. There's a lot of information in that book. Okay. It's rather impressive, Dal said to me after class. It's been years since I've had a student go undefeated for so long. Will anyone even bet against you anymore? I shook my head. That dried up a long time ago. The price of fame, Dal smiled, then looked a little more serious. I wanted to warn you before I announce it to the class. Next span, I'll probably start setting students against you in pairs. I'll have to go against Fenton and Bray at the same time? I asked. Dal shook his head. We'll start with the 2 lowest-ranked duelists. It will be a nice lead-in to the teamwork exercises we'll be doing later in the term. He smiled. And it will keep you from growing complacent. Dal gave me a sharp look, his smile fading. Are you all right? Just a chill, I said unconvincingly as I shivered. Could we go stand by the brazier? I stood as close as I could without pressing myself against the hot metal, spreading my hands over the glimmering bowl of hot coals. After a moment, the chill passed, and I noticed Dal looking at me curiously. I ended up in the Medica with a bit of heat exhaustion earlier today, I admitted. My body's just a bit confused. I'm fine now. He frowned. You shouldn't come to class if you aren't feeling well, he said. And you certainly shouldn't be dueling. Sympathy of this sort stresses the body and mind. You shouldn't risk compounding that with an illness. I felt fine when I came to class, I lied. My body is just reminding me I owe it a good night's sleep. See that you give it one, he said sternly, spreading his own hands to the fire. If you drive yourself too hard, you'll pay for it later. You've been looking a little ragged lately. Ragged isn't the right word, really. Weary? I guessed. Yes, weary. He eyed me speculatively, smoothing his beard with a hand. You have a gift for words. It's one of the reasons you ended up with Elodin, I expect. I didn't say anything to that. I must have said it quite loudly, too, because Dal gave me a curious look. How are your studies progressing with Elodin? He asked casually. Well enough, I hedged. He looked at me. Not as well as I might hope, I admitted. Studying with Master Elodin isn't what I expected. Dal nodded. He can be difficult. A question sprang up in me. Do you know any names, Master Dal? He nodded solemnly. What are they? I pressed. He stiffened slightly, then relaxed as he turned his hands back and forth over the fire. That isn't really a polite question, he said gently. Well, not impolite. It's just the sort of question you don't ask. Like asking a man how often he makes love to his wife. I'm sorry. No need to be, he said. There's no reason for you to know. It's a holdover from older times, I think. Back when we had more to fear from our fellow arcanists. If you knew what names your enemy knew, you could guess his strengths, his weaknesses. We were both silent for a moment, warming ourselves by the coals. Fire, he said after a long moment. I know the name of Fire. And one other. Only two? I blurted without thinking. And how many do you know? He mocked me gently. Yes, only two. But two is a great number of names to know these days. Elodin says it was different long ago. How many does Elodin know? Even if I knew, it would be exceptionally bad form for me to tell you that, he said with a hint of disapproval. But it's safe to say he knows a few. Could you show me something with the name of Fire? I asked, if that's not inappropriate. Dal hesitated for a moment, then smiled. He looked intently into the brazier between us, closed his eyes, then gestured to the unlit brazier across the room. Fire. He spoke the word like a commandment, and the distant brazier roared up in a pillar of flame. Fire? I said. That's it? The name of Fire is Fire? Elxadal smiled and shook his head. That's not what I actually said. Some part of you just filled in a familiar word. My sleeping mind translated it? Sleeping mind? He gave me a puzzled look. That's what Elodin calls the part of us that knows names, I explained. Dal shrugged and ran a hand over his short black beard. Call it what you will. The fact that you heard me saying anything is probably a good sign. I don't know why I'm bothering with naming sometimes, I groused. I could have lit that brazier with sympathy. Not without a link, Dal pointed out. Without a binding, a source of energy. It still seems pointless, I said. I learn things every day in your class, useful things. I don't have a thing to show for all the time I've spent on naming. Yesterday, you know what Elodin lectured about? Dal shook his head. The difference between being naked and being nude, I said flatly. Dal burst into laughter. I'm serious. I fought to be in his class, but now all I can do is think about all the time I'm wasting there, time I could be spending on more practical things. There are things more practical than names, Dal admitted, but watch. He focused on the brazier in front of us again. Then his eyes grew distant. He spoke again, whispering this time, then slowly lowered his hand until it was inches above the hot coals. Then, with an intent expression on his face, Dal pressed his hand deep into the heart of the fire, nestling his spread fingers into the orange coals as if they were nothing more than loose gravel. I realized I was holding my breath and let it out softly, not wanting to break his concentration. How? Names, Dal said firmly, and drew his hand back out of the fire. It was smudged with white ash, but perfectly unharmed. Names reflect true understanding of a thing, and when you truly understand a thing, you have power over it. But fire isn't a thing unto itself, I protested. It's merely an exothermal chemical reaction. I spluttered to a stop. Dal drew in a breath, and for a moment it looked as if he would explain. Then he laughed instead, shrugging helplessly. I don't have the wit to explain it to you. Ask Elodin. He's the one who claims to understand these things. I just work here. After Dal's class, I made my way over the river to Imra. I didn't find Denna at the inn where she was staying, so I headed to the Aeolian, despite the fact that I knew it was too early to find her there. There were barely a dozen people inside, but I did see a familiar face at the bar, at the far end of the bar, talking to Stanchion. Count Thrape waved, and I walked over to join them. Kvoth, my boy! Thrape said enthusiastically. I haven't seen you in a mortal age. Things have been rather hectic on the other side of the river, I said, setting down my loot case. Stanchion looked me over. You look it, he said frankly. You look pale. You should get more red meat, or more sleep. He pointed to a nearby stool. Barring that, I'll stand you a mug of metheglin. I'll thank you for that, I said, climbing onto a stool. It felt wonderful to take the weight off my aching legs. If it's meat and sleep you need, Thrape said ingratiatingly, you should come to dinner at my estate. I promise wonderful food and conversation so dull you can drowse straight through it and not worry about missing a thing. He gave me an imploring look. Come now, I'll beg if I must. It won't be more than 10 people. I've been dying to show you off for months now. I picked up the mug of metheglin and looked at Thrape. His velvet jacket was a royal blue, and his suede boots were dyed to match. I couldn't show up for a formal dinner at his home dressed in second-hand road clothes, which were the only sort I owned. There was nothing ostentatious about Thrape, but he was a noble born and raised. It probably didn't even occur to him that I didn't have any fine clothes. I didn't blame him for assuming that. The vast majority of the students at the university were at least modestly wealthy. How else could they afford tuition? The truth was... Well, my cats are fighting over there. The truth was, I'd like nothing better than a fine dinner and the chance to interact with some of the local nobility. I'd love to banter over drinks, repair some of the damage Ambrose had done to my reputation, and maybe catch the eye of a potential patron. But I simply couldn't afford the price of admission. A suit of passably fine clothes would cost at least a talent and a half, even if I bought them from a fripperer. Clothes do not make the man, but you need the proper costume if you want to play the part. Sitting behind Thrape, Stanchion made an exaggerated nodding motion with his head. I'd love to come to dinner, I said to Thrape. I promise, just as soon as things settle down a bit over at the university. Excellent, Thrape said enthusiastically. I'm going to hold you to it, too. No backing out. I'll get you a patron, my boy. A proper one, I swear it. Behind him, Stanchion nodded approvingly. I smiled at both of them and took another drink of metheglin. I glanced at the stairway to the second tier. Stanchion saw my look. She's not here, he said apologetically. I haven't seen her in a couple days, actually. A handful of people came through the door of the alien and shouted something in Yiddish. Stanchion waved at them and got to his feet. Duty calls, he said, wandering off to greet them. Speaking of patrons, I said to Thrape, there's something I've been wanting to ask your opinion about. I lowered my voice. Something I'd rather you kept between the two of us. Thrape's eyes glittered curiously as he leaned close. I took another drink of the metheglin while I gathered my thoughts. The drink was hitting me more quickly than I'd expected. It was quite nice, actually, as it dulled the ache of my many injuries. I'm guessing you know most every potential patron within 100 miles of here. Thrape shrugged, not bothering with false modesty. A fair number. Everyone who's earnest about it. Everyone with money, anyway. I have a friend, I said. A musician who is just starting out. She has natural talent, but not much training. Someone has approached her with an offer of help and a promise of eventual patronage. I trailed off, not sure how to explain the rest. Thrape nodded. You want to know if he's a legitimate sort, he said. Reasonable concern. Some folk feel a patron has a right to more than music. He gestured to Stanchion. If you want stories, ask him about the time Duchess Samista came here on holiday. He gave a chuckle that was almost a moan, rubbing at his eyes. Tiny gods help me, that woman was terrifying. That's my worry, I said. I don't know if he's trustworthy. I can ask around if you like, Thrape said. What's his name? That's part of the issue, I said. I don't know his name. I don't think she knows it either. Thrape frowned at this. How can she not know his name? He gave her a name, I said, but she doesn't know if it's real. Apparently he's particular about his privacy and gave her strict instructions never to tell anyone about him. They never meet in the same place twice, never in public. He's gone for months at a time. I looked up at Thrape. How does that sound to you? Well, it's hardly ideal, Thrape said, disapproval heavy in his voice. There's every chance this fellow isn't a proper patron at all. It sounds like he might be taking advantage of your friend. I nodded glumly. That was my thought, too. Then again, Thrape said, some patrons do work in secret. If they find someone with talent, it's not unknown for them to nurture them in private, and then he made a dramatic flourish with one hand. It's like a magic trick. You suddenly produce a brilliant musician out of thin air. Thrape gave me a fond smile. I thought that's what someone had done with you, he admitted. You came out of nowhere and got your pipes. I thought someone had been keeping you hidden away until you were ready to make your grand appearance. I hadn't thought of that, I said. It does happen, Thrape said, but strange meeting places and the fact that she's not sure of his name? He shook his head, frowning. If nothing else, it's rather indecorous. Either this fellow is having a bit of fun pretending to be an outlaw, or he's genuinely dodgy. Thrape seemed to think for a moment, tapping his fingers on the bar. Tell your friend to be careful and keep her wits about her. It's a terrible thing when a patron takes advantage of a woman. That's a betrayal. But I've known men who did little but pose as patrons to gain a woman's trust. He frowned. That's worse. I was halfway back to the university with Stonebridge just beginning to loom in the distance, when I began to feel an unpleasant prickling heat run up my arm. At first I thought it was the pain of the twice-stitched cuts on my elbow, as they'd been itching and burning all day. But instead of fading, the heat continued to spread up my arm and along the left side of my chest. I began to sweat as if from a sudden fever. I stripped off my cloak, letting the chill air cool me, and began to unbutton my shirt. The autumn breeze helped, and I fanned myself with my cloak, but the heat grew more intense, painful even, as if I'd spilled boiling water across my chest. Luckily, this section of road ran parallel to a stream that fed into the nearby Omethi River. Unable to think of a better plan, I kicked off my boots, unshouldered my lute, and jumped into the water. The chill of the stream made me gasp and sputter, but it cooled my burning skin. I stayed there, trying not to feel like an idiot, while a young couple walked past, holding hands and pointedly ignoring me. The strange heat moved through my body like there was a fire inside me trying to find a way out. It started along my left side, then wandered down to my legs, then back up to my left arm. When it moved to my head, I ducked underwater. It stopped after a few minutes, and I climbed out of the stream. Shivering, I wrapped myself in my cloak, glad no one else was on the road. Then, since there was nothing else to do, I shouldered my loot case and began the long walk back to the university, dripping wet and terribly afraid. Let's see. This is a bit of a longer chapter next. Relatively. I'm seeing, checking the time. Yeah, okay, so that's a good place to stop. We did 3 chapters, and that's a nice little, kind of mysterious ending to the chapter. Kind of leaves you wanting to know more. What's going on with, what's this burning that he's feeling? What's happening to him now? Let me see if I missed any comments. What? Yeah, that is possible. He could just be making this entire story up, in which case he would have he has a very thorough description of everything, so that's a pretty powerful imagination, especially if he's just like going off the top of his head. I need to remind myself what splinching is. Anyway, so yeah, that's that for tonight. And we'll continue this in a few days. In the framing story. Yeah, he's always getting hurt in some way or another. Alright. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.